and I write about comics for the New York Times. I've been doing that since about 2002, and the very first piece I wrote, I got to interview Paul Levitz for, so we go back a few years. Paul's life in comics is pretty amazing. He started as a fan, he became a writer and editor for DC, he was also their president and publisher, he's won an Eisner, and he teaches about comics. So it's really exciting to sit here and talk to him and hear some behind-the-scenes details over his career. I have one question to get us started. Let's talk about Vertigo. It's ending. Can you tell us how it started and how you feel about all the changes?
Sure. So one of the things that has always been most impressive to me about comics when the form works well is the power an editor's taste can have. And you look, whether it's Stan Lee in the peak years of Marvel, or Bill Gaines, Al Feldstein, and Harvey Kurtzman, sort of the editorial team at EC. Mort Weisinger doing the Superman comics in the 1950s when superheroes other than that weren't selling. Julie Schwartz. These were all people whose books you knew were part of the same thing, whether there was any actual credit to the person pulling it together. It wasn't just a matter of their taste. There was something about the sensibility that they brought to the material that gave it an identity. And in the late 1980s, Karen Berger, as a young woman at DC, having come from outside comics, not being a comics fan, was bringing a somewhat different sensibility to the film. She was very heavily involved with the British talent we were working with. She had, for a couple of years, been assigned to be our British liaison, which meant going over there and not getting herself drunk while all of them were getting drunk in the pubs, because that's where the British writers and artists like to hang out at their comic conventions, much more intensively than the American folks. But basically trying to sort through that gang, connect them to the American audiences. And she found in them interesting styles that we weren't doing here. And as an editor, she began to put out books that started to have that commonality. It's hard to put in words. It's hard to put. You can't easily describe what made EC Comics EC Comics. It's the O. Henry twist endings, it's the quality of the artists, but it's more than that. And over the course of a couple of years, the joke around the office became that it was the Bergerverse, that this was just a separate universe from the rest of the DC universe of titles. And it was starting to appeal to different audiences, particularly the breakthrough title of Sandman by Neil Gaiman, which was beginning to attract gasp women to read comics at a time when very few of them were, particularly goth girls, as an interesting subset within that. Something was going on, and we wanted to throw accelerant on that fire. And in order to do that, we had to do several things. One was really make sure that the audience understood that this was a different thing. And branding is a very powerful tool for that. So we decided to steal from the traditional book publishing and music publishing industries and deal with a separate imprint. Second, to screw around with our contracts. We had reached the point where it was possible to convince the parent corporation that we didn't always need to own all the rights to everything of the universe forever and ever and ever, and the children of that possible incarnation. So we came up with a slightly more civilized contract. Not awesomely groundbreaking, but incrementally so. But also to change the weighting of the relationship between the writer and the artist. Karen's books were very heavily writer-driven, so for the first time we had a different rate structure for a group of books that said, all right, we're going to pay the writers slightly higher rates than we do for the superhero material. We're going to pay the artists okay, but not our top rates for it. So budgets can average out in some reasonable way. And really to encourage Karen and the team she built to work with the talent in a different fashion, what we called authorial. It wasn't artisanal. It wasn't that we were turning over the complete creative control of the work to the creators. DC brought a lot to the table, and that was fine. We felt comfortable with that. But we wanted to show the kind of respect for the talent that was traditional in book publishing, and to try to evolve into those systems. And Karen pulled that all together. A lot of other people at DC, obviously in the sales, marketing, contractual, and other areas had an effect on it. Jeanette Kahn is the president and editor-in-chief in those years as the guiding visionary, saying, comics can do anything, let's do anything. Dick Giordano, who was the line editorial boss, me, Richard Bruning as the head of design at that point, designing the Vertigo logo with his designs on Karen at the same time.
Now we're getting the dirt.
It had something to do with a raccoon at an executive retreat. So somehow she jumped in his lap, and the rest of the story I never quite got because they thought I was too innocent.
You're blushing now, so I think you still are.
It's possible. I haven't been accused of innocence very often, but maybe a little bit in recent years. And it really worked. It became something that was very defined. It obviously has had a more problematic time in the last few years since Karen left, and then Shelley Bond, who was one of her co-workers, took over for a while and then left as well to go do, Karen went to do Burger Books at Dark Horse. Shelley was doing Black Crown over at IDW. And I'm sad to see it go. It's a different time in the marketplace. There are lots of ways to make business decisions. I'm not going to sit back and backseat drive what the guys are doing. It's their turn. But it's sad because I think it was something that really did a lot of good for the field.
Was there ever a concept that she came to you with that you just thought was too crazy to publish? And you said, no way?
Not so much ones that I thought were too crazy to publish. There were ones that I was really sorry we published a couple of times.
Oh, please.
We had conversations of that. We had a long discussion about the chicken fucking in Preacher. Do we have to do this?
Yes.
Bring me a note from your chicken, please. Just to know it's consenting. We had a long debate about Why the Last Man. When that came across the desk, I really thought this is the most basic male adolescent fantasy. Every 14-year-old boy has had a moment where he thought, if just all the other guys just dropped dead, then I could get laid. And Karen and Heidi McDonald, who's the editor on her team, who had brought it in, came in and, please trust us. Brian, who then was a brand new writer to the field, has this 60-issue plan. I said, 60 issues? This is going to make 12. Trust us. Well, when issue 60 came out, I had a cake made with a crow on it, and I invited Heidi, who was no longer working for us, into lunch, and they all got to watch me eat some crow. You gotta trust people.
That's great. Let's talk about Watchmen. I mean, obviously that existed before Vertigo, but I'm sure everyone in this room knows that Alan Moore has some issues with its continued existence. Was there any, a particular incident that sort of broke the camel's back? I think we recently talked about the Watchmen promotional button that might have been a...
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things that drove Alan crazy over the years. One of the things that was rough in his relationship with DC, there's a concept in business called self-liquidating promotion. You do an item that you actually sell for some number of dollars, but with no intention of making a cent on it, and it's just to make people more interested in the product. And when we were in the early stages with Watchmen, we did some Watchmen stuff that I think was buttons, and I think it was something else, maybe a portfolio, that we designed as self-liquidating promotion, no intent to make any money on it.
The portfolio also, because that was pretty fancy when I remember.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff, self-liquidating things can be fancy.
Wow.
It just doesn't mean you're out to make money with it. It's easier to do something fancy if you don't think you're going to make money. And we paid the initial royalties based on that. And Alan was very upset and said, no, this is merchandising, and I should be entitled to the percentage I'm entitled to get for merchandising. Well, merchandising in the contract was really intended to be licensed to other people to do, not things we were going to do ourselves. So we certainly had not budgeted for that kind of royalty. We went back and forth with Alan a little bit, but ultimately just said, all right, you feel strongly about that, we'll defer to you, and sent him his money. Took the loss on it. But that was one of the things that led him to feel that. Alan also seems to have felt there were certain things in his contract that, I went back a number of times over the years to look at I never saw there. And okay, I don't know whether he imagined it or whether he believes it fiercely. I think he's a very decent and honest man and a man of principle, so I don't think it's that he's trying to get away with anything. This is sincerely something he believes. But cumulatively, that and other things led to the breach.
What's your proudest accomplishment at DC?
I think I have to break it, I think, into two things. One is having done a number of things, including the first written contracts that were generally used in comics publishing for the talent, first broad royalty scheme for all of the talent. It's sort of a set of things to make it a more civilized publishing business. Again, not things that weren't existent in other fields like book publishing, but bringing some of those things to comics as a general practice and not simply as a best-in-class deal for whoever the hot talent that day was. And there were royalties in comics going back to the 1940s for stars like Simon and Kirby or Marston, who created Wonder Woman. But up until whatever it was, 1980 or so, 1981 when we did this, there wasn't any company that said, look, whatever you do for us, if it succeeds, you will win along with us, and here's the formula you'll win on. So that was one of them.
Did you have to cut yourself a check for the Huntress, or was that
I get some nice checks on her from time to time.
Nice.
The writer half of me really likes the fact that life is better for writers. He argues that we ought to have really made it much better for writers, but he doesn't win. I don't know why he doesn't win. E.L. Doctorow famously said that writing is the only socially acceptable form of schizophrenia. So I guess I got a little bit of that between the writer and the business guy. The other is really the role we played in making the graphic novel a standard format in this country. Again, nothing that didn't exist elsewhere in the world, but as a kid, I loved the fact that I could go into a bookstore and buy Agatha Christie or buy whoever that year's hot mystery writer was. I could go into a record store and I could get a Beatles album, or I could get a, Carole King album. It was true for most forms of entertainment. Not all. This is before VOD and before even DVD, so it wasn't really true for movies and TV at that point. But it certainly wasn't true for comics, and it didn't feel like there was any reason it shouldn't be true for comics. And we tried a couple of things, but ultimately the trade paperback form that we developed became the core standard in America. Again, we weren't the first, but we really built it into the standard, and I and the team that I worked with did a number of unusual deals and structural changes in the industry that made the system work and made it possible.
What was the first one? What do you think is the one where you can say from then?
It's Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah.
That was the game changer.
And was that the direct market only, or did that go to bookstores quickly?
We did a unique deal on it where we were part of Warner Communications, and there was a book company, Warner Books. Rather than licensing that material to Warner Books, which would have been the typical way it might have happened if anything would happen, we did a deal where we did a DC edition for the direct market, and we did a Warner Books edition for the book market, with Warner Books not paying any form of advance, but simply agreeing to split the profits according to a formula with DC, so we were taking risk with them. And we followed that deal for, I think, probably the next 10 or 15 books that we did with them, some of which were very profitable, some of which were not very profitable. But that really enabled those books to get first-class bookstore distribution.
That's great. I want to talk about Crisis. That was sort of my first big event as a comics fan. And I think in the collected editions, there's a talk about like the death list, and I think you were challenging them to, like, I think, be bolder in some of the changes they wanted to make. Can you just tell me anything about like just the process of, I would say greenlighting the project, and when did you know it was a success commercially, and when was it a headache editorially? Because I feel like we're still talking about Crisis now, and it didn't quite streamline things the way we thought it would.
Well, the idea that one of the disadvantages DC had was the complexity of its universe had been an argument in the office for at least a decade. Jerry Conway, as a young editor coming over to DC in the mid-1970s, was suggesting some kind of big bang, because he said, Marvel's universe is unitary, everything fits together. It's easier for people to access. DC's goes back all these decades, makes people's head hurt. Schmutz this together in some fashion. And nobody came up with a way to do it, or felt it was important enough to do, until the mid-'80s, when the combination of Marv Wolfman as the writer and Len Wein as the editor, and pulling George Perez in as more than the artist, because George always, at heart, is a fine writer himself, so he was always contributing to the process, really came in and said, we have the way to do this. And there was a great deal of debate over killing enough characters or important enough characters to make the changes seem important. Making the changes permanent. That didn't work quite as well. And getting cooperation, because this was going to span across the whole line. And it didn't thrill all of us as individual writers and artists, because we had to change our books or do things in our books to connect to it in the process.
Well, it really screwed you and Roy Thomas over the most, I would say.
Well, it wasn't so much Crisis as much as the new Superman stuff that John Byrne did emerging from it, where Superboy had always been a pivotal part of the Legion of Superheroes, and removing him dramatically changed the emotional structure of that book. And I felt that, if you go back historically to maybe our great-grandparents' time, you were a grown-up at 14 or 15. If you were a woman, you'd get married off at that point. If you were a guy, you'd get apprenticed off, or you'd be expected to work. You were supposed to be a responsible person. And then over the next, 150 years, I'm not enough of a historian to time this out really well, or I don't remember my history well enough, we invented this concept of adolescence and young adulthood. Well, this is in the 80s, I said, 1,000 years from now, maybe you grow up more slowly. And maybe the people of that century will look back and say, oh, you're only 30? Yeah, you're a boy. You're a kid still. And in fact, we seem to be moving in that direction. The concept of Odyssey and the sort of that period before you begin adulting. Interesting word. So that was how I proposed to fix it, to allow John to eliminate Superboy, but not eliminate Superboy from the Legion. That didn't work for John, unfortunately. So we had to play other things. I didn't win them all.
Let's talk about the Legion. What was your favorite part of writing it?
Being 12. I loved the Legion as a kid. It was the first comic I collected. I loved the multiplicity of the heroes. Long before there were action figures, I made paper dolls of the Legionnaires that I played with, hand-colored. I don't draw well. They were really, really awful and ugly. None of them survived, thank God. Everyone went to Black Manly with. When Creepy Crawlers came out, if anyone remembers them, I figured out how to use the Tarzan mold and carefully apply the goop in sort of vaguely the costumes of the different characters, so I can have little plastic Creepy Crawler style Legionnaires to play with.
Yeah.
So that was the best part. Now I had them all to play with. I could screw around with their lives and things. Does this mic go off?
Yeah,
It just went off.
Just one day.
Is there a switch that you hit accidentally?
You're welcome to mine if you like. Oh,
There we go.
Yep, it's back on.
I hit something.
Good job.
Thank you. And as a writer, it was a wonderful book to work on because you had this large cast, and you could go, okay, I'm going to fuck your life up now. You know, it's your turn. I don't know what's going to happen to you. Your relationship's going to hell. You're going to lose your superpowers. Your dog's going to die. You know, we can be really mean. And as soon as I'm finished with you, it's your turn. You know, I liked your uncle, but you know, he's gone now, so we'll just bury him, okay? When you write Superman, Lois isn't going to die. Lois isn't going to get her face scarred beyond recognition. Superman's not going to run off forever with the cute blonde. It just isn't going to happen. The minuet of the dance is locked. With the Legion, with the exception of Superboy, there really wasn't anybody whose life you couldn't fuck around with. And that created great storyline.
Yeah. Did you have a favorite character or a character you maybe did not like so much and you were extra into?
It depended on the day. Usually the favorite character was the one whose life I was screwing with the most of the time. And so, you know, sometimes it came about weird ways. I mean, when we did the Legion elections where people voted in, and one year somebody really ballot stuffed it and voted in Dream Girl. And it was obvious they had ballot stuffed it, but we didn't have a rule against that particular type of ballot stuffing. So, all right, let me give it a try. Dream Girl is the leader. She's never been a particularly interesting character. It's not the most visually interesting superpower. Her basic storyline has just been, she's just sexier than the rest of the female Legionnaires, and they all don't like her, and all the guys want her. Okay.
That can be a superpower.
You know, I'll trust your memory of exercising it honorably and safely, Ms. Mars. But okay, if she's going to be the leader, let me figure out who she is, and let me really play with this. And I really liked some of the stories I did as a result.
I'm curious, I think I read this online. Did Keith Giffen hate Sunboy for some reason?
He hated Karate Kid. I mean, I don't think he was fond of Sunboy, but he only killed him once. Karate Kid, I think he killed twice and tried to kill a third time. Keith's a wonderfully talented guy who I had a lot of fun working with most of the time. We had our occasional differences.
And the Great Darkness saga was actually before social media. Were fans all surprised when the big reveal happened?
I think so. You know, those were the days where you got fan letters. And my philosophy as a writer, when I write a mystery story, is I like to structure it so what I'm viewing as the smart reader who's trying to figure it out will figure it out a page or two before I do the reveal. That to me is the right pacing. We only got maybe one or two letters out of the several hundred letters we would usually get that called it as Dark Side. So, you know, you didn't know in those days in the way that you do today. And the good thing about it is it made it easier to do a story like that because everybody wasn't sharing their guesses with each other in a completely uncontrolled fashion. Probably people would have figured it out a lot faster if they'd been able to lean on each other's analysis of the clues that were there.
What was your favorite part about writing the Justice Society?
Again, sort of the inner 12-year-old. The first comic I bought off the newsstand was one of the parts of the first JLA SAT mode. What made that book special, I think, was the intergenerational relationship. I've been lucky enough in my life, because of the accident of my career, to have a number of good friends who were my parents' age. That doesn't happen in the normal world very much. And I'm not talking about people who were your parents' friends, who, you know, were sort of your honorary aunt or uncle. That's a relatively common thing. But just peer-to-peer relationships, guys like Will Eisner or Murphy Anderson, who were friends. And they were people who were very much aware of the world that had changed around them, but yet there were parts of them that were very much of the time they were born in. And I think there's something very interesting when you have that kind of intergenerational conversation going on. We see the world differently. I mean, I'm now moving into that section of it, certainly with regard to the comics world, where because I started so young, you know, I now remember a time that very few people working in comics remember. Because of what I've seen, I see the present differently. I'm not saying I'm wiser about it. I'm not saying it's a better view of it. It's just a different view of it. And that creates a different conversation when you have it. And I bring some things to it that a younger person can't as a reference point. You're not going to say the words Milton Caniff or Noel Sickles to a 20-year-old artist, and they look at you like, is that before or after Da Vinci? And I was just as stupid when I was that age, or just as ill-informed. I remember sitting there one afternoon, I don't remember who he was talking to, but just listening to Joe Orlando do sort of the family tree of the evolution of comics, with guys like Sickles in it. And I didn't pay much attention, and it didn't stick with me. And I'm deeply regretful that I didn't pay that attention. Because I could have learned that from a master who really understood it. But that intergenerational relationship is great story material. Hopefully I captured some of that in those stories.
As your career obviously changed a lot, the writer, editor, publisher, what aspects of each of those jobs did you like and not like, and did you miss them? Which one did you miss the most?
As an editor, I loved the creative interaction with people, the ability to challenge writers and artists, the ability to bring someone into the field who hadn't been working in it before. I think I was the first editor to successfully bring a working television writer to write a comic book with Alan Brenner. I'm incredibly proud. He wrote some amazing ones. He had his handful of stories, and really very well remembered ones. I published the first DC work of people like Michael Golden and Dennis Cowan and this kid named Frank Miller. I'm not sure what ever happened to him. I think he still pays me regularly to not allow them to reprint the weird war stories he drew from me. What I don't miss about that time is the fact that for the talent, editorial assignment decisions are enormously emotionally powerful. If you think you're ready to write Batman, if you have the great Batman story in mind, you look at the Batman assignment, you are not going to fucking forgive that editor for the rest of their lives. And there's no objective standard of whether the editor was right or not, right? So that was a much more contentious job in some ways for me than business. In business, sometimes I could take $1 million out of somebody's pocket and stay good friends with them. Because we were just moving poker chips back and forth. And, you know, it wasn't somebody's last $1 million. Probably would have been a good deal more contentious. But it was still $1 million. Well, I could find something to do with it they'd like. But, you know, it was understood rules of the game. It wasn't the same level of emotion. The thing about the business side, I got to affect everything. You know, the model of how the industry works today, for better and for worse, was affected by things I did with the team of people working with me. And in a lot of ways, I feel very proud that a lot of the things that are good about the industry today happened because of decisions we made and actions we took. And you don't have that impact as an editor of a handful of comics. Even if they're the best comics in the business, it's very rare. You know, maybe Karen could point to it with something like Sandman, but it's very rare that as an editor you get to impact the whole field in that kind of way. And as the job expanded over the years, I love the fact that I played with so many different industries, so many different facets. I got to be one of the very few executives in a movie deal, negotiated a TV deal, negotiated a video game deal, negotiated a toy deal, negotiated a publishing deal, negotiated a printing deal, convinced the Department of Justice not to put us in jail. Other minor little details like that. I get bored pretty easily. And the fact that the job was as diverse as it was one of the great joys to me.
Was that because like comics evolved so much? Like, I assume the job got more complicated as the TV shows and the movies and everything took off.
And part of it is the different media impact of it, certainly. Part of it is just how my job was defined. I mean, I didn't work on the creative side of the movie and TV stuff until Jeanette Kahn left to become a producer, and I inherited that side of the business. She'd been handling that for any number of years before, and I was perfectly, as between the two of us, we were both very happy she was doing that part of the job. Part of it was you're dealing with Superman and Batman, and these are iconic figures that affect the world's culture. So they touch everything. And you can sit there one day and you're trying to help make the decision about whose art should be on a superhero stamp that the post office is going to put out. And the next day you can be talking with the Defense Department's director of low-intensity warfare about doing a comic to teach kids not to get blown up by landmines that are left over in Bosnia. That's about as scary a fucking business card as anybody's ever handed to me, right? Low-intensity warfare. I don't want to meet the director of high-intensity warfare, thank you very much. But that room didn't open up because of me. That room opened up because of Superman and Batman. And I was just there for them. And it's so cool. And I met such amazing, diverse, and strange people. Many of them my readers. Many of them the business people or creative people that I worked with along the way. And it made for a fascinating life.
Is there any famous person that you were surprised was a comics fan, or either of your writing in particular, or the icons like Superman and Batman?
It was all bizarre. So our licensing guy does a deal to put the Batman symbol on some band's drum, and they're up visiting the office and they're tooling around. And he's going to tool them around. He's telling them the people he's going to bring them in to see, and he mentions me. And the band's trumpeter says, oh, Paul Levitz, I loved his Legion of Superheroes. Can I meet him now? And his name is Wallace Roney, and he's apparently a jazz superstar. I'm not a music guy. I didn't know the reference point. But Wallace comes in and introduces himself and tells me the Legion, you want to see Miles Davis's trumpet? I've got it with me. I was his protege. What? What planet am I on? I'm delighted by the people who are my readers and the bizarre and incredible things they've done in their lives, the contributions they've made to the world. People I see, here every year at the convention who I meet, who say that my work has touched their life in one fashion or another. And they tell me, I was talking with a fireman today who was there to be signed, and he was remembering that I had, in some conversation, said, at the end of the day, I think Batman's really a cop and Superman's a fireman. Because Batman goes out and he goes on patrol, trying to find the crime and trying to stop it, and Superman, the building's burning, the planet's about to explode, he rushes in to fix the thing. And this mattered to him. I hadn't thought about that remark or remembered I made that remark in decades, right? This is not me uttering some form of holy writ, but it mattered to him. And he's spent his life doing something maybe more important than I spent mine.
I have one more question, and then we can turn it over to the audience. You told me this when Batman turned 80, and I sort of got obsessed with it. You said, I think in the 70s, you had to read every Batman, Detective, and World's Finest.
When I took over editing Batman, one of the things I wanted to do was to make it all fit as much as possible. I was a continuity freak. So I pulled, and remember, this is 40 years ago now, so it was much more doable. So I just, Batman was up to issue number 300, not whatever the hell it is now. Detective, whatever the numbers are, four something. So I just went in the library, pulled them all out, and read them all for a couple of days.
For a couple of days? I mean, that just seems like...
Yeah, I read pretty fast. And a lot of them I had read before, so probably skimmed them the second time. That.
That's great. That sounds like a great job. If anyone in the audience has questions, yes?
First off, the living about Dark Side, that was me.
Figures.
And secondly, for all your accomplishments, and you were a very transformative figure in DC, was there anything, any initiative, anything you wanted to get done that you just never was able to get across the goal line quite?
Sure. Some of the things were contractual things that I could never figure out. I never figured out a formula legally that could deal with the idea that you'd be particularly sympathetic to, Mark, of how to have a formula to acknowledge story element contributions in plot if it was transformed into a movie or television show. Looking backwards, you can say, yeah, right, that's in there. But I never figured out a way to make that work. So we had to deal with it case by case for years. So when Constantine movie happened, for example, which, the guys who created Constantine were all going to get contractual compensation for. But the movie was really based very heavily on the storyline Original Sins by Garth. What do we do? So, I called around, found out what the guild price for an original treatment was. Said, well, it's sort of like an original treatment. Let's give them a check for that. Was that the right number? I don't know. But it was an honest number. But I'm sorry I didn't find a solution. I was talking with one friend about an hour ago about some issue that's going on in the industry and sort of mutually bemoaning, if we'd ever had a guild, we would have had a better way of dealing with that. And it wasn't something I worked hard at in the years when there was some conversation in the field about it, including some conversations I was part of. And by the time I really realized what a difference it might have made both for the publishers and for the creative talent, I wasn't in a position where anybody would have allowed me in the room for that, to try and make something like that happen. So, there were things along the way.
Any way to belittle your accomplishments? I just was curious.
No, look, and Mad disappeared this past week. I think I acknowledged in one of the pieces I wrote about it, I couldn't figure out how to fix that. Mad was on a downhill slope for many years before the 17 years I was a publisher. We threw a number of people at the problem along the way. We've tried to look at it a number of different ways. We kept it alive. I'm not surprised that it's disappearing. They didn't solve it, but neither did I. Maybe there was no way to solve it, but still pisses me off that I didn't.
You said basically with some of the younger artists that when you mentioned like older artists and things like that, they may not have any idea we were talking about the methods, but now as an educator and teacher, how do you work to ensure that they actually know about these artists and the concepts from before?
Well, an educator can't educate people that aren't in their class or aren't in their lecture or whatever the case may be, or don't read their book if they write a book about it. I'm not competent to write a book about the evolution of art and comics.
You didn't listen to Joe Orlando.
Hmm?
It's because you didn't listen to Joe Orlando.
Partly because I didn't listen to Joe Orlando, partly because I didn't do enough art history in school, or any. But you do the one-on-one education. I'm working on a new project with a young woman artist who hasn't been announced for the project, so I can't go into the details. But, you know, we had a first lunch to talk about the project, to talk about what she was trying to do. She had certain influences that she had, certain influences that she hadn't experienced. So we went and I started pulling books off my shelf and showing her stuff, artists she didn't know, went into the local comic shop, started pulling books off. You know, she had thoughts about, I'm not sure I know how to place blacks the right way. I need to learn about that. Oh, well, you know, here's an artist on a sort of vaguely comparable kind of work who does that really well. That's what you do as an educator from whatever podium you can, whether it's one-on-one or class at a time.
The woman in the fourth row. Yes.
So I read comic books associated with the big universes, and I also read independent books. And I read the big universes only because I like the characters, but I read the independent books because I like the stories. And I feel like there was a time when the two of them were not separate. They kind of came together. And I'm curious as to what you think the role of the movies has been in basically what I've described.
I think it's too soon to be sure. I'm concerned that the movies are doing a very good job of feeding the general public's desire for the superheroes and the TV shows, to the detriment of people wanting to read stories about them. I think that's one of the challenges we face in the field. Because each media form is what I describe as friendly to different kinds of story content. And you know, there was a time when radio had lots of drama and lots of comedy. And then television came along, and television was just better at that. It was more fun to see Superman flying, even if it was a cheesy jump by George Reeves, than it was to just hear the whoosh. I hope movies don't take the place entirely of superhero comics, ultimately. I think you can still tell a great story in a superhero comic. You can tell a great story about anything in comics form. It's a great medium. I don't read a lot of the superhero comics these days because I've read too many of them. So I'm sure there are some that have really wonderful stories. I hear very good things about any number of the writers working in the field today. There's some where I've dipped in a little bit and been impressed by what they do. You know, Tom King, Scott Snyder at DC in recent years, Brian Bendis when he was over at Marvel. I've read a little bit of his stuff just coming over to DC now. Lots of other people who are less brand names. It's all about story at the end of the day. I mean, not that art is important, but art is part of story. Art is just, whether it's writing or art, it's all about telling a story. And you have to do that well, whether it's a universe or whether it's what I did last week and why my date was bad.
So my experience is I learned from my mistakes. So I'm wondering if you made any incredible mistakes that you learned a lot from.
Well, I think if you go on the internet, you can probably find a pretty good catalog of my mistakes pretty quickly. There were mistakes that I learned from progressively. I talked about wanting to create something that resembled the graphic novel. Well, the first business attempt I made at that was licensing out Archie and Walt's Manhunter for an album format project that Roger Slifer and I think David Kraft published. And it was a complete failure. I mean, they were a micro publisher. The direct market was too small for it. It was black and white. It was album formatted and didn't fit the racks. The material was great material, but that was the only good thing about it. The second attempt a couple of years later, to accomplish the same goal, I put on the schedule a series of reprint individual issues with the idea that, well, if we go back like every 5 years and reprint New Gods or Green Lantern, Green Arrow, or Dead Man, or some of the great stuff, maybe the stores can keep them in print for a while. They'll keep the back issues cheaper. Nobody stocked them for any length of time. They didn't sell any real numbers. So sometimes it's a matter of iteration. You just keep trying until you find what works. There are other mistakes with just, I forgot that in costing this custom comic, and now instead of making money, the binding cost is going to be more than the profit, fucked that up really good. Next time, have somebody else check your numbers, Levitz. It's just sometimes a little sloppy about that.
Sir?
I have a question I've always wondered about, and maybe I'm sure you can answer it. Bob Kane, the co-creator or whatever of Batman, why was he so successful in whatever contract he negotiated with DC than all the other Golden Age or even after creators? What is it he did differently?
Well, Bob wasn't the only one successful. I mean, Marston had a much more sophisticated contract than anybody else at DC in that generation, because he was an established and successful grown-up before him, probably even had a lawyer, gasp. Simon and Kirby, at different points, both with Marvel and DC, had more sophisticated, better contracts in there. Siegel and Schuster had some pretty astounding deals in the 1940s. Bob had a very good deal as Batman became successful. Generally, the things that were great successes allowed the guys more negotiating room. I think Bob benefited from Siegel and Schuster's fighting with DC. You know, if the number one thing was blowing up, we better make sure the number two guy is happy. And I think Bob also benefited from the fact that he liked money. An awful lot of creative people to this day in comics don't pay much attention to their contracts, don't pay much attention to their deals. We have plenty of people who never read a contract when they signed it. And, you know, you could ask them to read it, say, you know, please pay attention, look at this, you know, this is important. But not everybody did. And whether it was Bob himself, obviously I wasn't around in the 1940s, or a family member who advised him at one point or another, Bob really liked to make a lot of money. And he worked hard to build a system to do that with a ghostwriter and ghost artists. And it was a very common system for the newspaper strips that he was bringing over. It was not perceived by the industry to be immoral or unusual in it. Was he a jerk about it at later points in his life? Yes. To not acknowledge. But he managed the business of being Bob Kane to maximize his profit. And not everybody does that today. And not everybody does it well, even if that's what they want. I think we can maybe get one more fast one in.
Yeah, I think so.
You had one. Anybody?
I was just kind of curious how your interaction was with like your Marvel counterparts when you were a publisher. How that, I mean, the relationship seemed a lot different back in the 70s and 80s, obviously, than it is now that you.
You know, a lot of people over at Marvel have been my good buddies. My old poker game included Jim Shooter back in the 70s, Tom DeFalco, as well as Len Wein, Mark Wolfman, Chris Claremont. You know, all variety of us, names you wouldn't know as easily. I think the only period when really we had a very acrimonious relationship between DC and Marvel was when Bill Jemas was responsible for the publishing there, and Bill seemed to view the World Wrestling Federation model as his stylistic model for how to pull Marvel out of bankruptcy. He's a very smart guy, he's a very good marketing guy. He chose a bunch of techniques that I disagreed with and in some cases detested. And I think it is mutual. And I think you're being told, stop.
Stop.
Thank you very much for coming and
Thank you,
listening.
everyone.
Thank you guys for letting me get away with this career, because I don't know what else I would have been qualified for, but I don't think I would have had nearly as much fun at it. Thank you, George.
Yeah, thank you, sir.